Under the muted glow of the airport's early morning lighting, the glass doors to the International Business Lounge slid open with a soft hiss. Abigail Sloane stepped inside, pausing just long enough for her eyes to adjust to the polished, carefully curated world that stretched before her. The air was thick with quiet opulence, the faint hum of conversation filtered through high-backed chairs, espresso machines whispered behind a sleek marble counter, and the rustle of expensive clothing accompanied the purposeful steps of men and women who seemed carved out of executive schedules. Abby stood in striking contrast to them, though she didn't appear to notice or at least pretended not to. She wore a soft beige sweater tucked into pale trousers, with a long dusty rose coat hanging loosely around her shoulders, its hem brushing the tops of her well-worn flats. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a low, neat bun that framed her face with a gentle precision. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, and yet she carried herself with an effortless grace that made her difficult to ignore. Not that anyone in the lounge was looking too closely. That was the unspoken rule of places like this. Look busy, look important, look elsewhere. In one hand, Abby held a slim leather folio clasped tightly under her arm like something worth more than it appeared. In the other, she gripped a paper coffee cup already half cold, judging by the pace at which she'd been drinking it since the cab ride over. She stepped quietly to the welcome desk, 8K, where a receptionist with a chiseled jaw and platinum name tag glanced up with the kind of distant professionalism that said she'd been trained to smile just enough. Her eyes, however, said something different. They made a quick, invisible sweep of Abby's outfit, lingering for the briefest second too long on the scuffed bag slung over her shoulder, the faint wear on her shoes, the handwritten initials on her folio's corner. There was a flicker of something in her expression, hesitation, perhaps, or quiet dismissal, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. "Good morning," she said. "This lounge is reserved for business premium and platinum members. May I see your credentials?" Her tone was calm, even pleasant, but carried the brittle undertone of someone who had delivered this same line 1,000 times before and expected the same outcome. Abby's voice was gentle when she replied, her American accent softened by the precise enunciation of someone used to choosing her words carefully. "Of course," she said. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and pulled out an envelope, plain white, thick paper, no logo, only a name at the bottom of the typed message, Jonathan Reeve. The receptionist took it between manicured fingers, brows drawing together as she scanned the single page inside. Her lips parted slightly as she read the short message, just 2 lines of text confirming Abigail Sloane's reserved access to Lounge 3A as arranged, followed by Reeve's unmistakable signature. For a moment, the woman said nothing. Then she cleared her throat, carefully folding the letter and returning it. "I'm sorry, MS. Sloane," she said smoothly. "This isn't our usual confirmation format. Do you perhaps have a reservation code or a membership number I can verify?" Abby smiled politely, though her shoulders drew just a fraction tighter beneath the fabric of her coat. "I was told this would be sufficient." She wasn't defensive. She didn't raise her voice. But something in the way she stood firmly, without apology, suggested she was not unfamiliar with this kind of exchange. The receptionist gave a short, practiced nod, but her eyes had already moved on, scanning the next person in line. "If you'll have a seat for a moment, I'll speak to my supervisor." She said it with a trace of emphasis, as though the word supervisor might discourage further conversation. Abby stepped aside with a nod, thanked her quietly, and walked toward the far end of the lounge. She chose a seat away from the others, near a frosted glass partition where light spilled in softly from the terminal windows. As she sat down, she set her folio on her lap and rested both hands on top of it, her posture straight but relaxed. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't fidget. She simply waited. And yet, within minutes, the whispers began. 2 men in tailored suits near the espresso bar exchanged a glance. One of them tilted his head toward Abby with a smirk, muttering something too low to hear but followed by a quiet laugh. A woman in a crisp navy dress, typing briskly on her tablet, paused just long enough to look over the top of her glasses. No one said anything outright, but the atmosphere had shifted. It always did in spaces like these when someone didn't match. Abby didn't move. She looked out the window, watching planes taxi across the runway, their mechanical certainty in stark contrast to the slow-churning discomfort now forming around her. The minutes passed with the slow, deliberate pace known only to places suspended between motion and stillness: airports, hospitals, courtrooms. Abigail remained seated, unmoving, while around her the quiet hum of activity persisted in rhythmic waves, the soft clatter of porcelain on marble, the discreet footsteps of attendants gliding through the space, the occasional cough muffled behind polite hands. From time to time, her eyes drifted across the lounge, catching fragments of lives she was not invited to enter, a young executive adjusting his cufflinks while rehearsing a pitch under his breath, an older couple sharing a croissant in silence, their closeness evident in the way their knees touched without ceremony. Despite her stillness, Abby was becoming the nucleus of subtle attention, though not in the way people yearn for. It was the kind of attention that came wrapped in unease, coated with questions that no one wanted to ask out loud. The receptionist had disappeared behind a frosted door marked staff only several minutes ago and had yet to return. In her absence, the low-grade curiosity in the room had begun to evolve into something more pronounced. It started small. A man in a charcoal vest walked past Abby's chair a second time, his gaze pretending to search for something behind her. A woman from across the room shifted her seat ever so slightly to face a better angle, lifting her coffee cup to her lips as cover for her scrutiny. These weren't overt acts, but they carried weight: the collective lean of the room toward judgment, masked as casual interest. At the coffee counter, a well-dressed man with salt and pepper hair, clearly someone used to being heard, struck up conversation with the temporary attendant now manning the welcome desk. His voice was just low enough to imply discretion but projected in the precise tone that demanded to be overheard. "New policy to let anyone in?" he asked, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth as he casually nodded in Abby's direction. "She doesn't exactly scream corporate account." The attendant, young and uncertain, gave a non-committal shrug, eyes flicking to the side. "Not my call," he murmured, but the man had already moved on, his words left hanging in the air like perfume, noticeable, lingering, deliberate. Abby heard it, of course. She heard everything. She was trained to listen for tone as much as content, to recognize the weight beneath words, the vibrations of skepticism in the throat. She didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the tarmac beyond the glass, where a line of service vehicles crawled around the base of a sleek silver jet like ants around a dropped crumb. Her hands rested lightly on the folio in her lap, the faint movement of her thumb against the leather the only indication that she was aware of the conversation swirling around her like fog. A new figure emerged from the staff door, a man in his late 30s, well-groomed, but with a headset tucked discreetly behind one ear and a name badge clipped to his blazer that read Craig Martin, Lounge Operations. He moved with a practiced authority, the kind that came from years of middle management, where confidence was expected but true power remained out of reach. As he approached the welcome desk, the receptionist handed him Abby's letter with a quiet word. Craig glanced at the paper, frowned slightly, and looked across the room until his eyes landed on Abby. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then began to walk toward her with the careful pace of someone preparing to be diplomatic. "Miss Sloan?" he asked, standing just close enough for the words to feel personal. Abby turned to him and nodded once. He gave a polite, corporate smile, pleasant, sterile, professional. "I understand you presented a letter of invitation from Mr. Reeve. I just wanted to clarify a few details if you don't mind." "Of course," she said calmly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Craig held the letter in one hand, as if its weight required both balance and scrutiny. "This format is unusual. We typically have all guest authorizations sent through our centralized system. I'm afraid there's no entry under your name." Abby nodded slowly. "That doesn't surprise me. I was told the arrangement was made directly, outside your standard protocol." He tilted his head slightly. "I see. It's just that, Well, without formal verification, it puts us in a bit of an awkward position. We have very strict policies about who's permitted access to this space. I understand, Abby replied, her voice level. And I don't want to cause any disruption. But I was asked to wait here until Mr. Reeve is available. Craig offered a brief, tight smile. Yes, I'm sure. It's just that some of our guests have expressed concern. Not about you personally, of course, he added quickly, though his glance toward the observing guest betrayed the truth. You know how people can be. Expectations, routines. I do, she said, her tone giving nothing away. He seemed to falter, sensing that his usual script was not yielding the expected compliance. Perhaps it would be more comfortable for you to wait in the main concourse? There's a cafe just past security that's quite nice. As soon as we get confirmation, I'd be happy to escort you back. Abby paused. For a moment, the air between them felt electrically charged, not with hostility, but with something quieter and more potent, disappointment. She looked down at the folio in her lap, then back at Craig. I'm comfortable here, she said, not defiantly, but with the unshakable certainty of someone who had learned the cost of stepping aside too often. Craig exhaled through his nose. Not quite a sigh. I see. Well, I'll reach out again. He turned and walked away, his spine a little straighter, his stride a little faster, as though eager to exit the discomfort she refused to absorb on his behalf. More glances followed. One of the suited men coughed into his hand, eyes narrowing with subtle contempt. A woman nearby began texting on her phone, though her attention remained fixed on Abby. It was no longer curiosity. It had curdled into judgment. They didn't know who she was, and in their world, that was all that mattered. Not what she carried in her mind, or what she had achieved, or whom she had been invited by, only that she didn't fit the expected mold, and therefore must have entered through some trick or loophole. Abby didn't move. She shifted slightly to cross her legs, carefully placing her folio atop her knee. She opened it and retrieved a single sheet of graph paper, covered in notations, lines, and sketches in soft pencil. She picked up a mechanical pencil from a side pocket and began to make quiet, precise adjustments to a schematic diagram and infrastructure grid, and, judging by the clusters of labeled nodes and intersections, her hand moved with practiced ease, entirely unself-conscious, as if she were alone in a study rather than being quietly exiled by a room full of strangers. One of the lounge staff, an older man, perhaps a technician of some sort, walked past her, paused mid-step, and glanced down at the paper without thinking. Something about the structure caught his eye, and he blinked, then looked again. His brow furrowed not in confusion but recognition. He didn't say a word, just nodded to himself and kept walking. The receptionist watched him go, then looked back at Abby. Her expression had shifted just slightly, just enough to show the first trace of uncertainty. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. After all, there was nothing to say yet. Nothing official. Just a name on a page, a girl in a beige coat, and a whole room full of people who were very certain they understood everything, until the moment they would realize they hadn't understood a thing. The next 10 minutes in the lounge unfolded in a kind of suspended tension, not dramatic or loud, but pervasive, like a subtle static that hummed beneath the surface of every exchanged glance and stiffened posture. The receptionist resumed her place at the desk but avoided looking at Abby directly, instead keeping her focus trained on the computer screen in front of her, eyes darting from window to window in search of some unspoken validation. Craig had not returned. He had disappeared behind the same frosted door through which he had emerged, taking Abby's letter with him, as if its very presence in her hands had been a disruption that required containment. Around her, the atmosphere had shifted from casual suspicion to a sort of communal agreement that something was off, though no one could define exactly what it was. It wasn't about what she had done; she hadn't done anything. That was the point. It was about the way she had remained, without shrinking, without reacting, without defending or apologizing. There was something unnerving in that for people who were used to their authority or their comfort being acknowledged without resistance. A few more glances were cast in her direction, less curious now and more pointed. One man, tall and severe in a navy suit with gold-rimmed glasses, stood and walked toward the refreshment counter, passing Abby's chair as he did. He slowed his pace just enough to look down at the diagram in her lap. "Engineering student?" he asked in a voice just loud enough to travel. The question, innocent on the surface, was laden with a smirk he didn't bother to hide. Abby looked up at him, her face neutral. "No," she said softly, "not anymore." The man chuckled, more to himself than to her, and moved on. A woman nearby, who had been listening, folded her tablet with a snap and leaned over slightly to her companion. "She's been sitting here almost 40 minutes, she whispered, not realizing or not caring that Abby could hear her perfectly. Surely someone would have confirmed her identity by now if she belonged here. Her companion, an older man with a crisp pocket square and an expensive tan briefcase, didn't answer. He simply glanced toward Abby with the cool detachment of someone calculating value. It wasn't the words themselves that carried weight, but the consensus they implied. If no one had come to claim her by now, she must not be legitimate. It was a logical deduction in a world that ran on schedules and sign-ins and systems where access was something quantifiable. Her presence, still, silent, unfazed, was beginning to grate on the room, not because of anything she did, but because of everything she didn't. She didn't explain herself. She didn't fidget or seem anxious to be validated. She didn't leave. That was the greatest offense of all. The quiet judgment began to crystallize into bolder behavior. One of the younger attendants, perhaps emboldened by the general tone of the room, approached the receptionist with a low voice and an eager posture. They spoke in hushed tones, eyes shifting toward Abby. The receptionist looked uncomfortable but eventually nodded, tapping something into her system. A moment later, the young attendant walked toward Abby with a forced smile, holding a tray with a sealed bottle of water and a paper cup. "Would you care for some water while you wait?" he asked, polite but overly cheery, the tone of someone offering a courtesy he didn't believe in. Abby nodded, her expression calm. "Thank you," she said, accepting the bottle without comment. The attendant lingered for a second, then added, "We're just trying to clarify a few things, but we appreciate your patience." Abby looked at him and replied with quiet firmness, "I know." There was no gratitude in her tone, but no rudeness either. Just awareness. The attendant's smile faltered, and he retreated. Moments later, Craig reemerged from the staff area, now accompanied by another man older, more sharply dressed, with a phone pressed to his ear and the distracted air of someone too important to be there. They walked quickly toward the front desk, speaking in low tones. The receptionist stood up, her posture suddenly more rigid, her voice lowered. Abby could hear only fragments, but the urgency in their whispers was unmistakable. There were too many variables, not enough certainty. Craig gestured toward her twice, and though no one pointed, the room felt the movement like a ripple in a still pool. The second man looked over at her just once, his eyes narrowing slightly, then returning to the screen in front of him. He nodded, muttered something into his phone, and then left as swiftly as he had arrived. Craig stayed behind, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Then came the moment that made the mood shift from subtle exclusion to active resistance. A new couple entered the lounge, both elegantly dressed, the woman in a sleek cream pantsuit with a structured designer bag, the man in a light gray jacket and crisp shirt. As they approached the desk, the receptionist greeted them warmly, recognizing them by name. "Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, welcome back," she said. "Your usual seating area is available." As the couple moved toward the back of the lounge, the woman caught sight of Abby and stopped, arching a sculpted eyebrow. "Are they allowing guests from general boarding now?" she asked lightly, but with unmistakable condescension. "I thought this lounge had standards." Her husband gave a chuckle, clearly enjoying the remark. The receptionist hesitated but said nothing, her face frozen in neutrality. Abby turned her gaze back to her diagram. Her pencil moved steadily across the page, erasing, adjusting, refining each stroke more precise than the last. A few minutes later, the receptionist approached again, this time without a smile. "Ms. Sloan," she began, "I'm sorry, but we still haven't been able to confirm your clearance through the system. Until we can, I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside the lounge." She wasn't unkind, but her tone had shifted from patient to procedural. It was no longer a conversation. It was policy. Abby closed her folio, slowly and deliberately, then stood. Her movements were graceful, but there was no resignation in them. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice low but firm. "And I've already explained that my presence here was requested." "Yes, I understand," the receptionist replied, already flustered. "But you have to see how this looks." Abby tilted her head, as if considering that. "To whom?" she asked. The receptionist didn't answer. Around them, silence had grown heavy. No one was speaking. No one was intervening, but everyone was watching. Abby looked around the room, taking in the suits, the jewelry, the curated expressions of those who hadn't expected to be confronted with their own assumptions. Then she nodded, not to anyone in particular, and stepped aside. "If this is your decision," she said softly, "then I'll wait where I'm welcome." With that, she gathered her things, adjusted the strap of her bag, and walked slowly toward the exit. She did not look back. She did not rush. But her presence, once dismissed as an intrusion, had become a mirror, and the people left behind were now forced to look into it. Just as her hand reached the door, it opened from the other side. A man in a dark tailored suit stepped through, tall and composed, his posture crisp with purpose. The receptionist gasped softly. Abby looked up, and for the first time her expression changed. It's only slightly, but unmistakably. Recognition, relief, something deeper than either. The man froze for half a second as his eyes landed on her. "Abby?" he said. Then, without waiting for an answer, he turned toward the staff desk with a voice that cut through the room like a blade through silk. "Why is she not inside?" The question echoed like a verdict, though no one yet knew what the sentence would be. For a moment, the entire lounge seemed to fall under a spell, time suspended between breath and consequence. The man's voice hadn't been loud, but it carried with an unmistakable authority that turned heads instantly. The receptionist froze mid-motion, her eyes darting between the woman she had just asked to leave and the man now standing before her, his presence too poised, too sharply defined to ignore. He wasn't flamboyant in appearance, no ostentatious watch, no obvious branding, but everything about him radiated intentionality. From the smooth drape of his dark suit to the subtle sheen of his leather shoes, he moved like someone who never questioned his right to occupy space. There was no arrogance, only certainty. Abby, still standing at the threshold, said nothing. Her hand rested gently on the strap of her bag, her posture relaxed but alert. She did not explain. She did not announce who he was or how they were connected. She simply stood, letting the moment unfold as if she had seen it coming, or perhaps as if it no longer mattered whether it did or not. The man turned fully toward the desk now, addressing the receptionist without aggression, but with a gravity that made his words land hard. "I'm Jonathan Reeve," he said, pausing only long enough for recognition to settle in. And it did. A visible ripple passed through the staff as his name sank into their memory: emails, bulletins, video calls, initiatives. He wasn't just an executive. He was the architect behind the infrastructure projects they referenced in daily briefings, the name that signed memos from the very top. And he was standing in front of them, asking a question none of them wanted to answer. "I arranged for Abigail Sloan to wait here," he continued, each word measured, deliberate. "Personally, I sent the letter you received. It was not a request, it was a directive." His gaze sharpened. "So I'll ask again. Why is she not inside?" The receptionist stammered, her voice faltering under the weight of consequence. I didn't recognize. There was no entry in the system, and we couldn't verify." "You didn't recognize her?" Reeve repeated, softly now, but in a tone that suggested the repetition was less a question and more a diagnosis. That's the reason? Craig, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward, visibly paler than he had been earlier. Mr. Reeve, we were just trying to follow standard protocol. There was confusion with the format of the letter and... Reeve turned his eyes on him, and Craig's sentence withered midair. You thought a printed document with my name on it, given to you by a woman I asked to join a private session, was suspicious? So you chose to treat her as though she were lying? As though she didn't belong? No one replied. No one could. The silence was brittle. Reeve's eyes returned to Abby, and for a moment, everything softened. I'm sorry, he said, with a sincerity that quieted even the whispered murmurs behind him. You should never have had to wait. This is on me. I assumed. He stopped himself, shook his head, then stepped aside and gestured inward. Please. Let's go in. Abby nodded once and moved forward, not rushing, not dramatic. As she passed the receptionist's desk, she paused just briefly and turned her head slightly. You asked me to understand how this looked, she said quietly. I hope now you understand how it felt. She didn't wait for a reply. As Reeve and Abby moved deeper into the lounge, toward the glass-walled conference suite at the rear, the entire room seemed to tilt. Conversations halted or dropped to murmurs. Phones were lowered. The woman in the cream pantsuit who had earlier scoffed about standards sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the back of Abby's coat as though it might explain something she hadn't prepared herself to witness. The tall man who had asked about engineering blinked slowly, then glanced away. Even Craig took a step back and adjusted his tie with the nervous energy of someone recalibrating his place in a hierarchy he no longer understood. Inside the conference suite, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. A small catering table had been set, the room arranged for a private presentation. On the long glass table sat a set of projection screens, a whiteboard, several thick folders, and a single document marked confidential, preliminary integration plan. Reeve gestured toward the chair at the head of the table. Please, he said. Abby took her seat without hesitation, setting her folio beside the documents already waiting. He sat across from her, folding his hands. For a moment they looked at each other not as executive and guest, but as two people who had met somewhere deeper on shared ambition, mutual recognition, silent loyalty. You had every right to walk out, he said after a pause. If you had, I wouldn't have blamed you. I considered it, Abby replied, her voice calm. But I decided to stay. If people don't learn from this, then nothing changes. Reeve studied her a moment longer, then gave a faint nod. Let's make sure they remember it. They began to talk shop, then not in cold jargon, but with the seamless rhythm of those who had built something together before and knew how the other thought. Reeve asked about updates to the model, and Abby pulled out revised schematics with annotations already prepared. They spoke about timelines, test locations, and licensing hurdles, the language of people with real stakes, real solutions. Back outside, however, the impact still reverberated. The receptionist sat frozen at her desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the screen before her forgotten. Craig walked slowly to a quiet corner of the lounge and sat down, staring blankly ahead. No one dared say anything aloud, but the lesson had landed harder than any reprimand could have. It hadn't been delivered through anger or spectacle. It had arrived through stillness, truth, and the quiet power of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. And that, more than anything, was what they would remember. Inside the conference suite, the world beyond its glass walls seemed to melt away, replaced by the quiet precision of collaboration. Jonathan Reeve stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of his chair, the other tapping lightly on the cover of a slim binder. Abigail sat opposite him, her posture relaxed but attentive, her hands folded neatly over her folio. The shift from dismissal to deference had already occurred within the lounge, but here, behind the partially frosted panels, the weight of that reversal had not yet fully descended. For now, they spoke in a shared cadence, one born not of hierarchy but of mutual respect. The content of their conversation was dense with technical nuance, layered with terms like energy redundancy models, sectoral load management, and cross-platform grid adaptation. Reeve listened carefully as Abby outlined a proposal she had annotated that morning while waiting under the wary eyes of strangers, her pencil mark still visible in the margins like whispered commentary to herself. What neither of them noticed was that, beyond the glass, the lounge had not returned to normal. Quite the opposite. The room had shifted in tone, from tense to reverent, from guarded to oddly expectant. It wasn't just that Reeve had walked in and addressed Abby by name, it was the way he had done it, without hesitation, with immediate apology and unspoken recognition, for a space that thrived on visual cues of belonging, brands, posture, recognizable faces. That moment had dismantled the illusion of certainty. What had seemed obvious hours ago was now anything but. People who had scoffed or whispered were now silent, their thoughts occupied by the possibility that they had misjudged not only a stranger, but the very structure that permitted them to do so easily. Craig, who had returned to his place behind the desk after a hurried discussion with an upper-level supervisor, sat frozen in a posture that bordered on shell-shocked. The receptionist beside him had busied herself with meaningless tasks, refreshing the screen, adjusting papers that didn't need adjusting, checking the time every 30 seconds. The irony was not lost on either of them. The woman they had just tried to remove from the lounge was now seated in their executive suite, discussing strategy with the man who held signatures over their entire operations. And they had no playbook for this kind of error. No training manual had prepared them for the quiet devastation of misjudging someone who, it turned out, outranked them in every meaningful way. But the shift in perception wasn't limited to staff. One by one, guests in the lounge began to reassess their own behavior. The woman in the cream suit who had mocked Abby's presence now sat stiffly beside her husband, scrolling through her phone with exaggerated focus, her earlier laughter replaced with a tight, unreadable expression. A pair of younger professionals near the coffee counter whispered behind their hands, their voices low and anxious. A man in his 60s who had earlier commented on standards now seemed preoccupied with his watch, tapping its face as though hoping time would reverse. Inside the conference room, Abby noticed none of this. She was deep into a schematic explanation when Reeve paused, holding up a hand. "Would you be willing to present this at the Geneva briefing next week?" he asked, his tone almost cautious, not because he doubted her ability, but because he understood what he was asking. Abby looked at him, surprise flickering for the first time. "Geneva was never part of the plan," she said slowly. "Not mine, anyway." Reeve smiled faintly. "Plans change. I want you there. I want them to hear it from the person who built the system, not the one who manages the meetings." Abby leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. "There'll be resistance," she said. "They'll want a polished speaker with a familiar last name and a bio that fits neatly into the pamphlet." Reeve nodded. "I know. That's why it has to be you. We're done performing credibility. It's time they see who actually does the work." As they spoke, a knock at the conference room door interrupted the rhythm. Reeve looked up. Craig stood on the other side, pale and composed, holding a small tablet in one hand. Abby's face remained unreadable as the door opened slightly. "I apologize for the intrusion," Craig began, his voice careful, almost reverent. "There's been an urgent message forwarded from operations. It concerns the Munich contract files you requested yesterday." Reeve gestured for him to enter, and Craig stepped inside, placing the tablet carefully on the table. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. "MS. Sloan," he said, with a small nod, "if there's anything else we can do to make your stay more comfortable." Abby looked at him, her gaze steady but not unkind. "Thank you, Mr. Martin. I have everything I need." Craig nodded again, then backed out of the room like someone leaving a cathedral. The door clicked closed behind him, and silence returned. A few moments later, Reeve stood and crossed to the window. He said quietly, I keep thinking about what just happened out there, about how automatic it was. The assumptions, the rejection, the certainty that you didn't belong. Abby joined him, standing beside him without speaking. He turned to face her. This is what they do, isn't it? Not just here, but everywhere. They look at someone like you and make a decision in a second. No questions, no space for error. You've probably lived your whole life between their expectations and your own truth. Abby exhaled slowly. The worst part isn't that they assumed I didn't belong. It's how comfortable they were doing it, as if it were a duty. Reeve nodded slowly, then looked at her with something deeper than respect. Do you want me to address it formally? The staff, the guests an apology, a statement, some version of accountability? Abby paused, then shook her head. No, let them sit with it. Let them live with the memory of that moment and how they acted in it. It'll teach them more than a policy change ever could. Back in the lounge, the ripple effects continued. Word had spread quietly but thoroughly. By now, most people knew who Abby was, or at least enough to understand that she was someone of consequence. The woman in the cream suit had stood to leave, but then sat back down again, perhaps too unsure of whether staying or leaving would seem more incriminating. One guest approached the desk to inquire about her own reservation and, without being prompted, added, "And please extend my apologies to Ms. Sloan. I believe I may have misread the situation." The receptionist merely nodded, too mortified to speak. And yet, through all of this, Abby did not re-emerge from the suite. She remained behind glass, not in isolation, but in deliberation. She had nothing to prove now, and that fact alone seemed to carry more weight than any confrontation ever could. Where others relied on being seen, she had relied on being right, and now that truth lived in the space she left behind. The power she held was not in her title or her invitation. It was in the restraint she showed, the silence she maintained, and the clarity with which she refused to abandon her place, even when no one else believed she had one. It was nearly 2 hours since Abigail Sloan had first entered the lounge, and yet the atmosphere had not relaxed. If anything, it had grown more fragile, like a vase teetering on the edge of a shelf still upright, but threatening to shatter with the slightest touch. The quiet murmurs, which had once carried a casual arrogance, now circled in lower tones, coated in a sheen of self-preservation. People sipped their drinks with more intention, tapped more lightly at their phones, and adjusted their posture as if the act of sitting straighter could somehow distance them from earlier judgments. Every movement was a recalibration. The balance had shifted, and they all knew it, though no one dared to say it aloud. Inside the glass suite, the conversation between Jonathan Reeve and Abby had turned from schematics to strategy. The atmosphere had become warmer, not in familiarity, but in respect, the kind that allowed ideas to be exchanged without performance. He had asked her opinion on integrating legacy grid systems with the new modular architecture, and she'd responded with clarity, drawing connections between power distribution patterns and social equity that made him pause. At some point, he stopped taking notes and simply listened, the corners of his mouth pulling into something that resembled not surprise, but confirmation, an internal nod to the instincts that had told him years ago she was worth listening to. Then came the knock. It was quiet, but assertive, two firm taps that silenced their exchange like a curtain dropping mid-scene. Reeve rose and walked to the door, opening it slightly, then stepping aside as a woman entered. She was in her late 50s, perhaps early 60s, with short silver hair styled into deliberate waves and a scarf tied around her neck in the way that suggested habit rather than flair. Her presence was neither imposing nor deferential. She walked with ease, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses, a name tag clipped neatly to the breast of her navy blazer, Helen Graves, VP of Global Partnerships. Abby stood instinctively as the woman entered, and Reeve made no attempt to introduce them clearly. They both already knew who the other was. Helen extended a hand, her voice smooth and measured. Ms. Sloan. I hope I'm not interrupting. Abby shook her hand without hesitation. Not at all. Helen turned briefly toward Reeve. I received the internal alert. I thought it might be best to address things directly. There was no need to elaborate. They all understood. Abby gestured toward a chair, and Helen sat, placing her folder carefully on the table as though this were any other meeting. But it wasn't, and they all knew that too. I want to start, Helen said, looking directly at Abby, by acknowledging what happened today, not as a procedural misstep, not as a breakdown in communication, but as a cultural failure. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. There was no ambiguity about your role, your invitation, or your authority. And yet, from the moment you arrived, you were treated as an anomaly to be justified rather than a guest to be welcomed. Abby did not flinch. She simply listened. The silence between them was not empty, it brimmed with something deeper, more honest than apology. Helen continued. I can't undo what happened, but I can make clear that it does not reflect the values this company claims to hold. And I can make certain that everyone involved understands the difference between policy and perception, between standards and assumptions. Reeve, who had remained quiet until now, added, It's not about a public statement. It's about the internal memo that gets passed around tomorrow morning. The meeting where we don't pretend this didn't happen. Helen nodded. Already in motion, Abby leaned forward slightly. Her tone was calm, but her words were sharp enough to carry. I'm not here to be vindicated, and I'm not interested in ceremonial apologies. She looked between them. What matters is that the next time someone like me walks into a room like that, there's no hesitation. No moment of calculation. Just the quiet expectation that she belongs, without having to earn it on the spot. Helen met her gaze. Understood. The conversation turned again, briefly, to logistics, to upcoming meetings, to a reshuffled itinerary that would now include Geneva. But the rhythm was different. The sharp edge had dulled into something clearer, not resignation, not satisfaction, but resolve. When Helen finally stood to leave, she extended her hand again. Thank you for staying, she said quietly. Abby offered a small nod, not of gratitude, but of recognition. Reeve walked her to the door and returned a few moments later, exhaling as he sat. I wish this hadn't been necessary, he said. But I'm glad it was you. Abby looked at him for a long moment. You keep saying that, she said, but you knew exactly how this would go. You didn't just ask me to be here. You expected this. Reeve's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't expect them to fail the way they did. But I expected you to hold your ground. Yes, his voice softened. I trusted you would. The glass door remained closed, but beyond it, the lounge had changed. The receptionist no longer met anyone's eyes. Craig sat hunched over his screen, typing slowly, every keystroke deliberate. Guests looked up only when necessary. No one laughed. No one whispered. The quiet now was not comfort, but awareness. The illusion of class and competence, once cloaked in polished surfaces and designer suits, had been stripped away to reveal something much less flattering. The ease with which dignity could be denied, and the discomfort that followed once it had been reclaimed. Inside the room, Abby gathered her papers, sliding them back into the folio with the same care she had used when first entering the lounge. She did not move with urgency. There was nothing urgent left. Reeve stood as she did, and for a moment they looked at each other without speaking. Then she extended her hand. He shook it firmly. See you next week, he said. We'll be watching from the front row. She smiled, just barely. Then I'll make sure it's worth watching. She walked toward the door, and this time, when it opened, no one stopped her. No one asked questions. No one dared. The silence that followed her exit was not the hush of disapproval, it was the stillness of a room remembering itself too late. By the time Abigail Sloane stepped back into the main lounge, the atmosphere had settled into a brittle stillness that was almost reverent, though no one would have admitted it. The space had been scrubbed of its earlier confidence, as if each person present had silently negotiated with themselves to adopt a different posture, less certain, more careful. Abby moved without hurry, her coat draped neatly over her arm, her folio clasped in one hand, and for the first time since her arrival, no one looked through her. They looked at her. Some glanced up with awkward curiosity, others quickly diverted their gaze, pretending to scroll, sip, not read anything to avoid meeting the eyes of the woman they had so assuredly dismissed only hours ago. The transformation in their behavior was not born from obligation or instruction. It came from witnessing the subtle but unmistakable shift in power that happens when the truth reveals itself not in a grand speech or reprimand, but in simple and undeniable presence. She passed the coffee counter where earlier whispers had buzzed, and now even the clinking of cups seemed muted. One of the baristas, younger and visibly tense, offered her a drink without prompting, but she declined with a nod, neither cold nor kind, just calm. Abby stopped briefly at a window, allowing herself a moment to look out across the tarmac. The light had changed since morning. The sun had climbed higher, throwing longer shadows across the plains lined like patient giants awaiting instruction. And her reflection in the glass looked no different than it had before. Same coat, same hair, same quiet strength in her eyes. And yet everything around her had shifted. Not because she had demanded it, but because the architecture of perception had quietly collapsed around her stillness. Behind her, Craig stood near the reception desk, watching her with an expression somewhere between regret and reverence. He did not approach. He had already said more with his silence than he could with an apology. The receptionist, once so certain in her role as gatekeeper, now seemed smaller somehow, not because of Abby's rise, but because of her own shrinking. Her hands fidgeted with a file folder that didn't need sorting. She was avoiding Abby's eyes not out of shame, perhaps, but out of recognition that she had not been cruel, only complicit, and that this was its own kind of guilt. Abby walked steadily toward the exit. As she reached the threshold of the lounge, she turned slightly, not to confront, not to acknowledge, but simply to pause. It was the kind of moment that draws attention precisely because it is not performed. She looked once across the room, and for those brief seconds the silence deepened. And then she spoke, not loudly but clearly enough to be heard by those who were listening. "You all knew what I wasn't," she said, her voice low and even. "But none of you paused to ask what I was." Then she turned, stepped through the doors, and disappeared into the hum of the terminal, leaving behind her not a scandal or a spectacle, but a quiet imprint, something heavier than anger, something more enduring than triumph. The people she left behind did not return immediately to their conversations or their coffee. They sat, holding their devices, their pride, their assumptions a little more tightly, a little more aware. Aware. And somewhere, in the deepest corner of that polished room, respect finally found a place to sit down.